Police officers of Reddit, what's the creepiest disappearance case you've ever been assigned to? Story 1. Not a police officer, but my granddad was. He was a part of the police force in the 60s till the early 80s. Sometime during the 70s, he was assigned to a missing persons case that had been ongoing for a while. It had actually been reassigned due to the lack of new evidence. Him and his partner spent months on the case fighting for it to stay open. One day, they went and searched the missing person's home again. It caused a lot of uproar with the family, as they hadn't really moved his things or been into his home since the case had gone quiet. Anyway, they got permission almost a month after asking, and found a handwritten receipt for a car in his bathroom bin. God knows why his bins weren't searched before, unless it was just missed. They managed to track down the guy who sold him the car. He said that the missing person had mentioned that he was going to store his car in a garage till he had the money to insure it. He even gave them the name of the town he said the garages were in. They went to the town and got search warrants for every single rentable garage, even though they had no evidence he ever rented one. After a couple of days, they found the car with the guy inside it. Apparently, his body was almost mummified because of the lack of sun, air, and moisture. I can't imagine what the smell was like. But they think he accidentally killed himself while trying to do some work on the car. He would have had the garage door closed because his car wasn't insured. He didn't want anyone to see the car and steal it. It was stored in a rough neighborhood where the garages were cheap to rent. He also paid cash in hand, so he never had any receipts. So yeah, he died of carbon monoxide poisoning. It's painless and basically you just fall asleep and then you die. He wouldn't have realized until it was too late. The guy was missing for 5 months and he seemed to just disappear for no known reason. My granddad told me this when I was a kid, and it really scared me that people can so easily just go missing or die, and nobody knows where they are. Still kind of freaks me out. See, this is why I always tell my friends who work on cars to make sure they're working somewhere with the garage door open, or someone knows where they are, and if they don't hear from them in a little, to go to that location. It's really sad that he passed alone, but at least the family can take peace in knowing it would be relatively painless. Story 2. My grandfather was a policeman and a fireman at different points in his life. His spooky disappearance story actually came from his time as a fireman. He hasn't told me this story in a long while, so I'm a little fuzzy in the details, but here goes. His team gets called to a house fire in a small village, rural England. It's late at night. The fire was reported by a local who's walking home. Several other bystanders have arrived by the time the fire engine gets there, and there are multiple reports of screams for help from inside the building. They start to douse the fire, and 3 of the responders, including my granddad, enter the building via the back door to attempt to rescue the people trapped inside. The thing is, they don't find a soul. Nobody is there. They clear the whole place out, stop the fire, effectively make the building safe. Later on, it's confirmed that the fire started in the kitchen, likely the hob, where food was midway through being prepared. As far as anyone knew, the couple who lived there had been at home. Relatives had no idea where they might have gone that night. My granddad and his colleagues have a funny feeling, so they get the local police properly involved. Crime scene investigation uncovered blood on the floor in one room, but any other evidence was destroyed in the fire. They can't confirm who the blood belongs to. It apparently didn't match the blood types of the 2 vanished residents. The fire department are very suspicious at this point, and apparently the police want to drop the investigation in favor of a manhunt for the missing people. But they end up expanding the investigation radius and find that apparently an unidentified van was parked outside the house that left just before the fire was reported. The investigation goes dead, but over a year later, they find the burned remains of the man who lived there in a grave in the woods several towns away. They never found the woman, so it was suspected that she killed him and burned the house down to conceal it. They never figured out where the screams from inside the building were coming from, though. That is really weird. The only thought I have is maybe the man screamed inside the house and then was dragged out by the woman, except that would mean that she would have had to move extremely fast. Anyone have any thoughts on what the scream was? Story 3. I'm a corrections sergeant for a small county in rural Alabama. About 2 years ago, I had just become a supervisor. I was assigned to Delta shift, which at that point was considered the crap shift. I was brand new and given the task of whipping this bunch of turds into shape. I was barely 1 month in the driver's seat when one of my most trusted inmates just goes ape crap. It was in mid-February when this occurred. relatively cold and very crappy. The inmate involved had been in and out of the facility for most of his life. Papa had nearly more clout in the jail than I did. The man was the most trusted inmate we've ever had, and was even assigned to work alongside the maintenance officer with limited supervision. Until the night that he ate apparently 2 ounces of M-word and proceeded to freak the freak out. Papa asked to be let out to fix a toilet in booking. The control officer let him out and then let him roam up to the booking foyer. Here, we entirely lost track of him. The detention center spent the next 9 hours on lockdown thanks to this. When my officers finally found him, he'd gotten into the ceiling access with a stolen key. Papa had watched us from the master monitor in the server room the entire time. Every time someone would look in the server room, he would hide inside the cabinets. If we got too far from finding him, he would scream at the top of his lungs until we turned around. All from the ceiling across the entire jail. Creepiest experience of my life. I've seen some crap. Through the infantry and this job. Nothing beats this one. Not even doing CPR in a suicide. Crap was bone-chilling. Too long, didn't read. Corrections officers search for a highly unstable and intoxicated inmate for the better part of a night, sometimes being less than a few feet away from them. Sounds like the most messed up game of Marco Polo I've ever heard of. At least no one ever got hurt, so that is a definite plus. I feel like this is a prime example of how people who are relatively nice and well-mannered can honestly make a huge shift as soon as they take drugs. They honestly really shift people, even if you really think you know somebody. I feel bad that this guy probably never was able to go back to the way things used to be, and was treated like every other dangerous inmate. Story 4. Not a cop, but had a pretty freaked up disappearance happen. About a mile away from where I live, a girl went missing. She was 12. The whole town, state police, and I believe possibly the FBI all got involved. Search parties in the woods and through the streets for about 2 or 3 days. Turns out she'd gone over to these kids' houses that she knew from school to have them fix her bike. Turns out the kids, brothers 15 and the other 17, planned on stealing it. Well, she put up a struggle and the one brother wound up strangling her in his basement. She was found a few days after she went missing. They stuffed her body in the trash can on trash night. Not a cop, but I did my undergrad at a college in Vermont. In the winter, we would quite literally be snowed under. Over Christmas break, a sophomore went missing. He wasn't a close friend, but we had a couple of classes together. It was a small liberal arts college in a small town, so everyone in the community was pretty freaked out. His phone and wallet were left in his room. So the theory was that he'd been abducted and maybe even killed. Campus got really scary for a few months. There were police everywhere, helicopters overhead, students marching through the snow in lines looking for a body. Finally, when the snow and ice thawed, they found his body in the creek. Police surmise he entered the water from the bridge and down, but no one knows if he jumped or was pushed. This one still haunts me. Someone commented, "Similar story from my growing up in Russia. A big town had a university nearby as well. It seems like every few years, some kids got too drunk and stepped outside when it was too cold and died, often without much of their clothing." Story 5. Very late to this party, but whatever. Growing up in BC, we hear a fair share of missing persons cases. Hikers never to be seen again. The Highway of Tears, human trafficking, etc. I find the ones that stick with me the most are ones that were solved relatively quickly and don't have to do with any of those. The one that is the most horrifying to me happened when I was in high school. A girl around 17 years old was reported missing after not showing up to school for a couple days. It wasn't unusual for her to miss school, as she suffered from crippling migraines, but it was unusual for them not to be excused. There was a welfare check after no answer from her parents, and when the police showed up, they found what has been one of the nastiest crimes in my town since my parents were kids. Apparently, the girl's parents were having relationship problems due to the girl's health issues and inability to live a normal life. Her mom suffered from some mental health issues over it. Turns out the father cracked and decided to put the family out of their misery. He shot the girl and her mother dead, posted about it on Facebook, and then shot himself as well. No idea why no one picked up the Facebook post right away. Really sad for my town when that news came out, as the girl was a beloved member of the community and tremendously talented. I can never understand people, especially parents, who decide to hurt their families simply because they are struggling mentally. I know that's probably an ignorant thing of me to say, because I'm sure the father was suffering too, but I still can't ever imagine in the future hurting my possible child, simply because I'm mad at my partner. Story 6. Late to the party, but here goes. Responding to a missing person report. Husband was the caller reporting his wife was missing. Wife had a debilitating condition and was bedridden for several months. Husband said he went to dinner across town and discovered wife was gone upon returning home. No sign of her in the house or in the area. No kids were living at home. Search and rescue came out and spent all night searching around the area with no luck. Scent dogs didn't even find anything. The whole time I'm imagining we're going to be discussing this case sometime in the future on Forensic Files. It was an eerie feeling to be sitting with a man and talking to him, while thinking he may have just killed his wife, but having to treat him like he was a concerned husband. Fast forward to the next day and a neighbor found her, about a block and a half away, tucked down behind their bushes in their yard. No foul play. Turns out something just happened and wandered away, but she lost energy and collapsed in that yard. Sadly, she reported seeing the glow sticks on the scent of dog collars walking nearby on the road, but nobody or none of the dogs came close enough in the yard to find her until that neighbor came out that next morning. Somebody commented, "Oh, that poor scared woman." Story 7. I'm late to the party, but I'll answer. We get a call from a husband that his wife and mother-in-law have been missing for 3 days. Their 2 small children are with dad, and he claimed he didn't know what happened. The husband had a massive history of domestic violence with his first wife, and we were pretty concerned for the well-being of his wife and mother-in-law, especially since they vanished without packing and didn't take the kids. I show up at the house, and the husband gives me the creeps. Just a really freaking weird vibe. And every single hair on my body is standing up. I feel nothing but dread as I listen to him tell me that he has no idea where they went and couldn't explain why he waited 3 days to call the police, especially with 2 small kids at home. We couldn't find any trace of evidence, and I was really perplexed. Found out later that the wife and her mom went across the US border to go shopping, and they both got arrested for shoplifting and were spending a week in jail while waiting for trial, since they were Canadians and a flight risk. It was hilariously awkward breaking the truth to him, but a huge relief. Somebody commented, "This didn't go the way I expected. Sounds like Brooklyn Nine-Nine material." Yeah, this one honestly just gives me very weird vibes. Maybe the guy has changed for the better, and that's honestly all we can really ask for, but it does seem very suspicious that he didn't report his wife missing for 3 days. Although, yeah, I can only imagine how that conversation went, where it was probably initial relief, and then just extreme frustration with the wife and mother-in-law. Story 8. I'm not a cop, but in my hometown near Savannah, Georgia, just a month or 2 ago, a 14-year-old girl was missing for 2 weeks before it was reported. One of the neighbors was concerned that she hadn't seen the girl in so long, and after a while, the police figured it was the father and stepmother. They brought out the dogs and found a grave just off the property, where the girl had been buried, and they ended up finding her brother, too, who had also been murdered by their father 2 years prior at the age of 14, who he said he had moved out of state to live with their mother. Nobody ever questioned his disappearance, but the father and stepmother had apparently been abusive their whole lives and pretty much kept them locked up. Somebody commented, "I lived in Richmond Hill up until a year ago. My wife saw this when a friend posted it on Facebook. It's really heart-wrenching. From what I've been told, it's also getting people in Atlanta talking about potential homeschool reforms so that homeschool children can't just disappear like that. Don't know if anything's gonna come from it, though." Story 9. In the town I grew up in the UK, a woman in her 30s, her 3 kids, and their car all went missing. Her husband was known for being a bit of a lad, and the immediate presumption was that she'd had enough and left him, but her parents hadn't heard from her. Her bank account wasn't used, etc. But it was nearly a week before anybody seemed to get really worried about it. She'd picked the kids up from school and then never went home, even though it was only a 10-minute journey. Eventually, one of the 10-year-old son's friends mentioned that he was planning on trying to get his mom to go and get them a McFlurry. The nearest McDonald's was a town away. They eventually realized that instead of going straight home, she'd agreed to drive them to the McDonald's and gone the back way, part of which is along what we call the 40-foot, basically a massive dike. Found them all strapped into the car at the bottom. Husband was engaged again, and his fiancée was pregnant within a year. I've seen a lot of these kinds of stories on Am I the Butthole, where children are lamenting their parents getting remarried and having kids again, less than a year after losing one of their parents. And it's honestly infuriating. I know people are allowed to fall in love again after losing a spouse, but to some extent when it is such a small time frame, it looks incredibly suspicious. I'm not saying the father did anything to harm the family, just that maybe the guy had been cheating for a while. Story 10. Not a cop. My friend's dad had died from a diabetic coma, so his mom started dating again. She met this dude who was a meth head, and she got into drugs with him. One night while I was at my friend's house when she was out, she called him and said that the guy and his friends were trying to redirect the spirit of a Stevie Ray Vaughan, and she freaked out and drove off. She didn't know where she was, but wanted him to not come home. And the police found her truck with all her stuff strewn about in a field. No one could find her. I think 6 or so months later, a hunter, about 100 yards or so in some woods, found a jawbone, and DNA proved it was her. The authorities think that she had a psychotic episode because of the and freaked out, ran into the woods and fell and died, and was taken by animals. Very traumatic. Story 11. Dealt several times with a young mother who would always go missing for a few days and leave her child with relatives. Several missing persons reports over time. Turns out she was shacking up with her PCP dealing boyfriend in a nearby city. One day the lady walks in and says her daughter was kidnapped. I do some work and find that the aunt took the child because mom is just a terrible person. State did not want to get involved, so we have to give the kid back. I turn to my partner and tell him mom will definitely be dead within a few months. Probably turn up in a ditch or dumped in the river, where she goes to visit her dealer boyfriend. Fast forward 3 months and I turn on the news to see a story of a woman found dumped in the river. It was mom. She was stabbed to death by her boyfriend and dumped in the river. That one creeped me out a bit. Somebody commented, "So how do you enjoy being a psychic?" Story 12. My uncle went missing about 25 years ago in New Jersey. My dad has been so sad about it ever since, and this was before I was born. He had a history of mental illness, but the weird part is he had never been found. We don't know if he changed identities or got killed or went off his meds and went homeless. But it's been over 2 decades and it's still puzzled me to this day what happened to him. My dad even got Howard Stern one day to say live on air, "Kevin Costello, if you're out there and listening to this, your brother is looking for you." I remember being a kid and listening to it on the radio. He just disappeared without a trace. It's so odd. My dad went through some of his belongings and has a trunk of some of his old stuff still in storage. Someone commented, "I'm really sorry. That's awful. I hope one day your dad and the rest of your family get some answers." These kinds of situations are so hard for the family because a lot of people choose to believe different things to relieve themselves of as much guilt or pain as they can. My mom's brother went missing for a little before we found out what happened to him, and I know it was easier for her to believe that he was still alive, as it gave her hope, while her other brother believed he had passed as it was easier for him to accept it. I think it's all a matter of personal belief about whatever helps people feel the best. Story 13. Not me personally, but other officers in my department. A 70-year-old female with dementia would often leave her home and go for walks around her property. One day, she never came home, and it should be noted that we live on an island 30 miles out from the rest of the United States. State police, canines, our entire department, news helicopters, Coast Guard helicopters, and boats, Marine Division, all searched land and ocean for this woman. We reviewed security footage at the airport and steamship ferry to see if she boarded earlier to leave the island. But she didn't. She was never found, and to this day, we don't know what happened. 2 theories have arrived, though. She walked right into the ocean and somehow her body disappeared and washed up. Or 2, she walked into the construction site of a sewer plant and fell into a tank full of waste, just before the tank was permanently covered. Story 14. Years ago, a girl 10 to 12 years old went missing in Arizona. It was so mainstream that 1 out of 10 cars had some signage and almost all businesses did. Years after the disappearance, a man in prison lets a CO know he had some information. The guy's an enforcer, causes pain or death when you do not pay. He wants to trade. The deal? You tell us everything, bad acts and all, and we will trade those for your information. This guy has to admit to several murders he committed, but was never implicated with. He knew where her body was. They take him out wearing protective gear and find the spot. To no avail, it appears the body was moved. He also let them know that dad has a large drug debt, and he sold his daughter for a snuff film to repay it. Again, these kinds of stories make me feel so mad because it's centered around someone who is unfit to be a parent and put their own needs above their child's. It's a horrible thing for people to know that this is how a poor innocent child died, all for someone's stupid drug habit. Story 15. Brandon Lawson. He ran out of gas on the highway in the middle of the night and called his brother to come help him. Shortly after, he called 911 and reported that someone had chased him into the woods and that he needed police. Eventually, his brother and one police officer arrive at the scene and find his truck abandoned, but no sign of Brandon. Brandon calls his brother and says he's bleeding and is 10 minutes away from his truck. That was the last anyone ever heard from him, and searches of the area turned up empty. Someone commented, "Imagine running out of gas at like 3 a.m. and someone pulls over with the intention of killing you. I can't even imagine what I'd be thinking." Story 16. I'm not a cop, but when I was in high school, a kid in my class went out fishing with his dad one weekend in the bay. They never came back. Searches went on, but nothing. Never found any bodies. They found the boat a few weeks later, empty, of course. It's been 8 years and nothing has ever been found. It's assumed they fell overboard, maybe in some rough weather, and drowned. They were both avid fishers and could swim. Weird that no bodies were ever found or washed up. Somebody commented, "It's especially odd since over 90% of bodies resulting from water-related deaths, drownings, high falls into water, etc., are recovered." Story 17. Not a cop, but back in my home state, there was a little girl that went missing on her way to school. It was huge news because the family was cleared pretty quickly. Like a week or so later, they find part of her body in a field. Then, this 19-year-old guy's mother notices a smell in his room, finds the rest of the little girl and calls and has him turn himself in. This case always stuck with me. Somebody commented, "What the frick?" Props to the mom of the killer who didn't try to hide what her son did and gave the family some closure. I know it's always hard for parents of criminals to see their children as such, so I really do think it's impressive and commendable that she did the right thing. Story 18. My stepdad worked a case. My dad and my little brother lived in an apartment down the street from this 12-year-old girl who went missing. She was walking home at night and was abducted on her way. It was about 3 weeks until they found her, but the guy let the officers in, and right there in the middle of the living room floor was her mangled remains. She'd been cut up into pieces. Story 19. My grandfather was a sheriff on the West Coast in the 70s. I don't know a lot of details because he never talked about it, but I know he was part of a team who recovered multiple sets of remains that turned out to be Ted Bundy victims. Apparently, it was the most graphic thing he's ever seen. The Ted Bundy case always gave me chills, how so many people either didn't or chose not to believe he did it, only because he was handsome and people were attracted to him. I saw this really good documentary on how it's an example of when pretty privilege goes so far as to actually allow people to get away with horrible things, all because of their looks. Story 20. I'm glad now that I installed security cameras on the outside of my house. It seems so many of these stories have no witnesses, and having footage of anything that might help could be valuable. Somebody commented, "Yeah, I was looking into getting a Ring doorbell system anyway, and this thread is sealing the deal." Story 21. Most of the missing 411 stuff is pretty freaky. Some of it is explainable, but a lot of it just doesn't add up. Things like 2-year-old kids walking up and down multiple mountain ranges in a couple hours and found dead without a scratch on them. I'm not sure about the one it mentions here just because to me it sounds just like hypothermia. But after some more investigating, a lot of these 411 calls are pretty interesting. A lot of them try to argue something paranormal happened, when in reality it feels like pretty practical advice, like don't go without proper equipment, or make sure someone is tracking you. But some of them are pretty weird and may have been paranormal. Story 22. The one where a man left his fiancée a detailed financial instruction sheet, including the cancellation code for their Netflix subscription, with the following line at the bottom: "They found the kitty stuff again." Someone commented, "Man, you can't do me like this." Story 23. College blogger. Upset student activated emergency pillars and talked to office on speaker. Said she was being chased by unknown people. No one was at the scene when officers responded. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.